Hey guys, Karenology here. This one is pure gold. Pettiness, drama, and an ending that will leave you speechless.
I always thought that after 50, life would finally cut me some slack. I pictured slow mornings, the smell of coffee floating through my modest kitchen, afternoons spent fixing up the old shed that leaned tiredly in the corner of my backyard like an old hound. But that image shattered one spring morning when flashing blue lights lit up my gravel driveway, and a woman named Karen, wrapped in a flower-patterned blouse and a hurricane of righteous indignation, marched toward me with a clipboard clutched in her manicured claws. "Mr. Sanders," she barked, "you are in violation of several Homeowner Association codes regarding exterior structures." I squinted against the rising sun, still holding the wrench I had been using to tighten a loose bolt on the porch swing. "Good morning to you too, ma'am," I said, my voice dry as West Texas dust. She didn't smile. Karen wasn't here for pleasantries. I had moved to Silverwood 3 months earlier, looking for peace. My wife had passed 5 years ago. My son was stationed overseas, and the city noise gnawed at me more than loneliness ever could. This place, with its wide skies and rustling cottonwoods, promised the kind of quiet a man could grow old in. Or so I thought. At first, the folks seemed decent. A nod from old Judge Hobbs, a batch of cookies from the Garcias down the lane. Even Brian Thompson, my next-door neighbor, lent me his ladder, with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. But in Silverwood, smiles often masked knives. Karen's inspection was the beginning. Days later, I found a citation stuffed into my mailbox. $500 fine for unsightly structures. The shed, my shed, built by the calloused hands of the man who once farmed this land, was apparently an eyesore. I laughed, a low, disbelieving sound that echoed off the cracked wooden fence. That laugh didn't last long. One Saturday, I returned from a fishing trip to find the padlock on my shed broken. The door hung ajar and muddy footprints tracked across the threshold. Inside, boxes had been rifled through, tools knocked over. Rage boiled up from somewhere deep, but beneath it ran a chill of unease. I had an arrangement with an old friend from my days as a contractor, Agent Carla Mason from the ATF, to store evidence from an ongoing case temporarily in my shed. Nothing dangerous, just paperwork and sealed crates. But it made what Karen and her crew had done not just an intrusion. It made it a federal offense. The next day, Carla pulled up in an unmarked truck. She listened without interrupting, her face set in a grim line. "You have footage?" she asked. I nodded, leading her inside to the old security setup I had installed mostly to keep raccoons out of the trash. We watched grainy video of Karen, Brian, and a woman I recognized as Dolly Wilson, pushing open the shed and snapping pictures with their phones. Carla whistled low. They have no idea what kind of mess they're in. By Monday, the neighborhood buzzed like a kicked hornet's nest. Karen circulated a petition accusing me of hoarding hazardous materials and endangering the community. Flyers showed up taped to light poles, warning families to keep their children away from the Sanders property. My pickup got keyed in the grocery store parking lot. Brian stopped making eye contact. Judge Hobbs rolled up in his battered Oldsmobile one afternoon as I was sanding a plank for the porch. "Don't let 'em push you out, son," he said. voice raspy with age. Folks like Karen, they feed on fear. You stand your ground. Easy for him to say. The Homeowner Association held more power in Silverwood than the sheriff himself. Karen called an emergency meeting, and rumor had it she intended to vote me out of the neighborhood altogether. You couldn't legally evict a homeowner, not without cause. But cause was something Karen and her friends seemed eager to manufacture. One night, sitting in my creaky old recliner with a beer sweating in my hand, I thought about packing up, cutting my losses. Start over somewhere nobody knew my name. But the thought curdled in my gut. I'd buried a wife, raised a son, survived worse than a clutch of bitter busybodies. This was my home now. I wasn't about to let anyone steal it out from under me. The next morning, I walked to the shed. The door groaned open. Dust motes danced in the shaft of light cutting across the floor. It smelled like old pine and memories. I tightened the lock, double-checked the cameras, and set my jaw. If Karen wanted a war, she'd get one. But she wouldn't like how it ended. By evening, word spread that Karen had summoned the Homeowner Association board to review the threat I posed. They planned to petition local law enforcement for an injunction. That night, as I sat on the back porch under a wash of starlight, a figure crept through the trees. I stayed still, heart hammering slow and steady. A shadowed form approached the shed, crouching low. I watched, breath shallow, as they fiddled with something near the lock. Just as I moved to confront them, a twig snapped under my boot. The figure bolted, crashing through the underbrush. In the faint glow of the moon, I caught a glimpse. Brian. The same man who'd once smiled as he handed me a ladder, my hands curled into fists. I wasn't just up against Karen now. I was surrounded by wolves in sheep's clothing, and they had just made their first real mistake. Morning came with the heavy kind of stillness that sets a man on edge. I brewed a pot of coffee so strong it could peel paint and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the grain of the wood like it held answers. Brian's face, startled and guilty, burned in my mind. Whatever he and Karen had cooked up, it wasn't over. I spent the day reinforcing the shed's locks and installing a second camera, one hidden under the eaves where no curious neighbor would think to look. As I worked, I noticed Judge Hobbs sitting on his porch across the street, rocking slow and steady. Our eyes met, and he tipped an imaginary hat. A small gesture, but it bolstered my spine more than he probably realized. By midday, a thick envelope appeared in my mailbox. No stamp, no return address. Inside was a letter from the Homeowner Association, signed by Karen herself. They demanded I remove hazardous structures immediately or face escalating legal action. Beneath the official language, it reeked of desperation. They were trying to scare me into submission. I tucked the letter into my jacket and drove down to see Carla Mason. Her office was small and smelled of coffee and old carpet, but the badge on her desk was real enough. She read the letter, lips tightening. "They're bluffing," she said. "But bluffing can still land you in a world of trouble if the wrong people buy it." Back home, the Garcias stopped by. Dan and Lily were young, maybe mid-30s, both former military, sharp-eyed and steady-handed. They brought over a pie, peach, the kind that tasted like summer afternoons and simpler times. We sat on the porch, eating pie and talking about Karen's antics. "You're not alone," Dan said quietly. A lot of folks here are tired of her games. Yeah, Lily added. But most are too scared to speak up. That night, I couldn't sleep. Memories stirred. My father telling me, "Son, a man's only as good as the ground he stands on. Lose that, you lose everything." I stood at the window, looking out at the dark shapes of trees, the faint gleam of the shed's new lock catching moonlight. The next day brought escalation. Someone, and I didn't need 3 guesses who, had vandalized my mailbox. It lay on the ground, bent and twisted, letters scattered across the dirt. I picked them up, one by one, a tight knot forming in my chest. Among the bills and junk mail was a flyer. Protect our neighborhood. Say no to dangerous hoarders. My face had been photocopied and plastered beneath the headline. I drove straight to the county office and filed the report for vandalism and harassment. The clerk, a woman with tired eyes and a coffee-stained sweater, promised to look into it, but I didn't expect much. Around here, the Homeowner Association carried weight. That evening, I found Judge Hobbs waiting on my porch. He handed me a manila folder, thick with documents. "Karen's been dipping into the association funds for years," he said. "Here's proof, and I know just the folks who'd love to help you bring her down." Inside the folder were financial records, invoices for community improvements that never materialized, payments to companies that didn't exist. My gut twisted, not from fear, but from the thrill of having real ammunition. We decided to act. Dan, Lily, Hobbs, and I met late at night in my living room, the air thick with determination and the smell of old wood. We planned to call a special community meeting, gather enough signatures to force a leadership vote. Karen wouldn't go down easy, but if we moved carefully, she couldn't stop us. The next morning, flyers circulated, this time from us. Demand transparency, reclaim our community. Karen retaliated fast, hosting an emergency meeting at the town hall. She stood there, righteous as a Sunday preacher, spinning tales about external threats and dangerous elements undermining our way of life. I stood up in the middle of the crowded room. "You talk a lot about threats, Karen," I said, voice carrying to the rafters. "What about the threat of leaders who think they're above the rules?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Karen's smile faltered. That night, someone slashed the tires on my truck. As I knelt in the gravel, examining the ragged rubber, I felt a presence. Dan stood nearby, shotgun slung casually over his shoulder. "You're not alone," he said again. The moon rode high and full above Silverwood, casting long shadows across the fields. War had been declared, and I wasn't about to retreat. The next few days felt like standing in the eye of a storm, knowing full well the winds were gathering just out of sight. I kept my routine simple, fixing the fence, tending the small patch of vegetables by the porch. But every noise, every unfamiliar car crawling down the street set my teeth on edge. Silverwood had become a town divided, and the cracks showed in every stiff nod and closed curtain. I met with Dan and Lily in the back of Hobbs' garage, surrounded by dusty boxes and the comforting scent of old motor oil. We mapped out our strategy with the precision of soldiers planning a siege. Our petition was gathering signatures faster than expected. Folks tired of living under Karen's thumb, finally finding their courage. Still, we knew Karen wasn't the type to let go without a fight, and fight she did. Flyers accusing me of harboring illegal activities started appearing again, more vicious this time, hinting at everything from drug dealing to terrorism. One morning, I found a dead possum nailed to the shed door, an ugly, crude warning. I buried the poor creature out back, hands steady but heart burning with a slow righteous fire. Carla Mason called late that night. "We're moving forward," she said. "Federal charges for unlawful entry and tampering with evidence are on the table. Your footage is airtight." "Good," I said, my voice a gravelly whisper. "Because they're not just after my shed. They want to break me." She paused. "They're scared, Roy. Scared people do stupid things. Watch your back." The next evening, the town council convened for a community safety meeting, a transparent attempt by Karen to smear me publicly. I showed up in my cleanest jeans and best flannel, boots polished to a dull shine, and sat in the front row, where she couldn't ignore me. Karen's speech dripped with false concern. She spoke of protecting our children, preserving our values, and rooting out dangerous influences. Every third sentence was a veiled jab in my direction. When she finally opened the floor, I stood. "Funny thing about values," I said, my voice carrying over the rows of folding chairs. "They're like a fence. Good ones keep the wolves out. Bad ones just pen good folks in." A ripple of murmured agreement stirred the room. Karen's eyes narrowed, her smile tightening like a noose. Then Brian Thompson, betrayer extraordinaire, stood up. "I've seen Mr. Sanders' property. It's not safe. He's hoarding who knows what back there." "And you know this because you broke into his shed?" I asked calmly. The room went dead silent. Brian stammered, face flushing crimson. Judge Hobbs chose that moment to roll forward in his wheelchair, voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "I've seen the evidence. Maybe it's time we stop worrying about sheds and start worrying about who's been emptying our association's coffers." Karen tried to regain control, banging her gavel and calling for order, but the tide was turning. People whispered, exchanged glances. The seeds we'd planted were sprouting. Later that night, back home, I sat on the porch swing, the wood creaking under my weight. The air smelled of rain and cut grass, heavy with the promise of change. A pickup truck idled across the street longer than it should have. I watched it, heart thudding slow and steady, until it finally pulled away. The battle lines had been drawn. The next few days would decide everything. Sleep came late and restless. I dreamed of my father's voice, of long dusty roads, and the slow work of building something that lasts. "Stand your ground, boy," he said, voice fading like a radio signal. "A man's got nothing if he's got no pride." When dawn broke, gray and cold, I knew one thing with the clarity of a blade honed to a perfect edge. I wasn't backing down. The next morning, Silverwood felt different, like the air itself was waiting, holding its breath. I loaded my truck with a stack of copies, petitions, evidence files, financial records Hobbs had unearthed, and set out to meet Dan and Lily at the town square. We planned to hand-deliver everything to the county office before Karen could find a way to block us. As I rolled down Main Street, heads turned. Some nodded. Others quickly looked away. Fear still lingered, but hope was catching like a brush fire in dry grass. I parked by the old courthouse steps, and together with Dan and Lily, carried our arsenal of paper inside. This is going to stir up a hornet's nest, Lily said, glancing over her shoulder. Good, I muttered. It's time they felt the sting. Filing the complaints took longer than expected. The clerk, a younger guy named Travis, raised an eyebrow as he flipped through the files. You sure about this? Dead sure, I said. It's time the truth came out. He gave a slow nod and stamped the documents with a heavy thunk that echoed in the small office. Outside, clouds gathered on the horizon, low and heavy. It felt fitting. Storm's coming, old man, I thought. Best brace for it. The Homeowner Association called an emergency meeting that night. Not at the town hall this time, but at the old church. Neutral ground, harder for Karen to control. I sat in the front row, hands resting calmly on my knees. Hobbs rolled in beside me, flanked by Dan and Lily. Karen took the pulpit, her flowered blouse clashing with the somber wood of the altar. She started her speech, all honeyed words and hollow promises. But the crowd was restless. Whispers hissed through the pews like dry leaves. When she paused for breath, Hobbs rolled forward, holding up a thick manila folder. We've seen enough, he said, voice strong despite the years. The people deserve better. A murmur rose, growing louder. Karen's face twisted, her smile collapsing under the weight of it. Then Dan stood. I move for a vote of no confidence in the current Homeowner Association leadership. Silence, sharp and electric. Seconded, Lily said firmly. All in favor, Hobbs called. Hands, shut up. Not everyone, but enough. More than enough. Karen tried to protest. Voice rising, but Brian Thompson, looking pale and cornered, finally cracked. I'm done, he said loudly. I won't cover for you anymore. The floodgates opened. Accusations tumbled out. Misuse of funds. Intimidation tactics. Lies stacked on lies. People who had once been too scared to speak now found their voices. Karen turned on her heel and stormed out, her entourage trailing behind her like a defeated army. After the meeting, under the flickering lights of the parking lot, Hobbs clapped me on the shoulder. You did good, son. You reminded them what community really means. I felt something deep and solid settle in my chest. A piece I hadn't known I'd been missing. The next day, the newly formed interim committee, led by a quiet, no-nonsense woman named Marcia, filed formal charges against Karen. Financial misconduct, abuse of authority, harassment. It didn't stop there. Carla Mason worked with the county prosecutor to build a federal case on the illegal entry and tampering with evidence. Brian, desperate to save his own skin, provided testimony against Karen and her closest allies. One crisp morning, I watched from my porch as an unmarked sedan pulled up in front of Karen's house. 2 agents stepped out, badges flashing. She protested, loud enough for half the street to hear, but it didn't matter. They led her away in handcuffs, her screams trailing into the cold air. I leaned back in my chair, savoring the moment. Justice didn't always move fast, but when it did come, it hit like a hammer. Dan and Lily came by that afternoon with a six-pack and grins wider than the Texas sky. We sat on the porch, sharing quiet laughter and a sense of hard-earned relief. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just about Karen. It was about something bigger. About standing up when standing down would have been easier. About reclaiming not just a piece of land, but a piece of dignity. The shed stood behind the house, battered but stubborn, like the old man who owned it. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like home. Even as the sun dipped low and the first stars pricked the sky, I knew the fight had been worth it. I thought about my son, about the kind of man I hoped he'd see when he looked at me, and I smiled, ready for whatever the next sunrise would bring. Spring melted into summer, and with it came a kind of slow, satisfying rebuilding. The scars Karen left on Silverwood didn't vanish overnight, but you could feel the town stitching itself back together. One neighborly nod, one barbecue invite, one freshly painted fence at a time. The interim committee held elections, and Marcia was officially voted president. She was steady, fair, and knew how to listen, qualities we hadn't seen in leadership for a long time. Meetings became less about fines and more about potlucks and park cleanups. Folks started remembering what community really meant. One evening, as cicadas buzzed in the humid dusk and the scent of cut grass hung in the air, Marcia came by with a letter. It was official. My shed had been declared a heritage structure, protected under county historical preservation laws. No more threats, no more fines. Just a piece of land, a piece of history, standing proud. About time, I said, accepting the letter with a slow grin. Later that night, I sat on my porch, rocking gently as the stars winked awake above me. I thought about everything we'd fought for, everything we'd risked. It wasn't just about a shed or even about the land. It was about the principle that a man has a right to stand his ground, to protect what's his, without bowing to bullies, no matter how many rules they hide behind. I rebuilt the shed proper that summer. New boards, sanded smooth and strong, fresh paint, but not too much. I wanted it to keep its soul, its memory of hands rough with work and hearts stubborn with hope. Inside, I set up a little workshop, the kind I used to dream about. A place to carve, to fix, to create. Kids from the neighborhood started dropping by. Curious at first, shy. I taught them how to hammer a nail straight, how to sand a plank smooth, how to listen to the grain of the wood like it was telling you a secret. Little things, maybe, but important. Dan and Lily became regular visitors. We'd sit out back some evenings, beers in hand, watching the sun sink behind the fields. Sometimes we talked, sometimes we just sat in comfortable silence, the kind that only comes after a battle hard won. Judge Hobbs, too, rolled by now and then, sharing stories of a Silverwood most of these young folks had never known. A town built not by committees and codes, but by neighbors leaning on each other, mending fences and mending hearts. One afternoon, I got a letter from my son. He'd be back stateside soon, his deployment ending. I read his words over and over, feeling pride and relief twist together in my chest. He wrote, "Heard about what you've been through. Proud of you, Dad. Proud to be your son." That letter sat on my workbench for a long time, right next to the old hammer my father had given me when I was just a boy. A reminder that some things, some fights, are worth every scraped knuckle and sleepless night. Karen? Last I heard, she'd moved 2 towns over, trying to worm her way into another association. But word travels fast in places like Silverwood. She wouldn't find it so easy the next time. Some reputations stick harder than old paint. As for me, I stayed, planted deeper roots, found new purpose in old wood, in teaching, in standing tall. And every time the wind rattled the windows or the shed door creaked on its hinges, I smiled. Not in fear, not in bitterness, but in simple, stubborn satisfaction. Because here, in this battered little town, with its cracked sidewalks and weathered porches, I'd found something Karen and her kind could never take away: home, and the kind of pride that no piece of paper, no gavel, no threat could ever erase.